adult and children's classes. We pray that you would bless us, that you would grow us in faith in you and your word, and that you would help us to understand your work in history, and that these things would lead us to a more godly life and a mind directed towards you. So bless us now, we pray, in Jesus' name, amen. All right, the children are dismissed at this time. Okay, so we are continuing our discussion of the old school, new school split. Today we're hopefully going to actually get to more of the details of what happens. We've been kind of leading up to it, trying to get background. So there's a lot going on. Anytime there's a church split, it's complicated usually. So last time we briefly discussed there was a trial in the Presbyterian Church in 1831 against Albert Barnes. And Barnes was a new school pastor, theologian, and so he's going to end up going with the new school in the split. But he was acquitted, and so that was a big deal. And then we mentioned there's a couple memorials done by the old school, basically protesting the errors of the new school, and they're trying to get support for their position. So we mentioned the Western Memorial, which I think was 1834, and then you had the Act and Testimony, which was similar but got a lot more attention. Charles Hodge opposed it, even though he was not new school, but he just thought some of the old schoolers were going too far. And so what I want to look at today is we'll mention the second trial of Albert Barnes, 1836, which also he's acquitted there. And that really is going to lead up to, when you think of the years, 1837. So 1836 kind of watershed year. 1835 is a big deal though too. I'm going to mention abolitionism again because it's at the General Assembly. So I've been saying this before, but just to make it clear, there's kind of two things contributing to the old school, new school split. One is the doctrinal divide, old school, new school, but then abolitionism is also a major issue, and that's, I would say, a big part. It's not the only reason, but it's a big part of why the South, for the most part, not all the churches, but the Southern churches throw their weight behind the old school, which helps actually cause the split. Okay, so because actually when the churches divide, old school and new school, they're pretty similar in size. So that's why actually you're seeing kind of back and forth between power, like who controls the assembly each year? Well, one year it's old school, then it's the new school, back and forth. So it's kind of crazy, but it's because they're pretty similar in power and size. Okay, so the old school held a pre-assembly convention going into the 1836 assembly. So this has almost become commonplace at this point. The old school is meeting, they're having conventions before the assembly to discuss things and kind of plan how they're going to approach the assembly. And they issued a declaration of errors that included the heresies of Taylor. If you recall, Taylorism is the most extreme of the kind of New England theology. So most of the new schoolers didn't hold to that. So they refer to the heresies of Taylor and the policies of Finney. So if you recall, Charles Finney came out of the Presbyterian Church. And actually, he didn't leave the Presbyterian Church until 1835. So it's pretty wild. He had been doing his revivals in Western New York. And he became a professor of theology in 1835 at Oberlin College in Ohio, and then was a pastor of the First Congregational Church there. So, so that's Finney. So there's claims that Finney's tied with all of this. Go ahead, Dan.
Question regarding that meeting before the assembly. What do they call that?
A convention. They would call it convention.
But that's not part of the.
It's not part of the assembly. So it was just
a. They voted to make decisions. Meeting of the decisions they made.
They had a president, like a moderator. Yeah, so it's weird. I don't know exactly how to describe it other than, like, you can go read. They'll have like official things they adopted and whatnot. So yeah, it's like an old school. It's like a faction saint basically.
The Presbyterians self-associate with that?
Some of the presbyteries did, yeah. They would like support. They would support like the Act and Testimony. You had presbyteries that would officially like endorse it. So then when they would have the convention, I mean, in one sense, the convention seemed to have a formality, but they didn't really have any power. What they were doing is they were just kind of preparing these statements that they would then propose to the assembly, right? So it was basically the old school's way of preparing for the General Assembly.
So it's much more general. The big thing in the PCA used to be this NP, the partnership.
The National Partnership, yeah.
Really was lesser organized than that.
Yeah, because these were open. Like, everybody knew this was going on.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that they did this. So the old school won the 1835 assembly, we could say. They had the majority there and things went their way. But that wasn't the case in 1836. 1836 was a new school victory, which then this explains what's going to happen. The next year is the 1837. Then it shifts back. The old school has the majority, and then they just say, we're done, and they effect a split. So we'll get there. But so 1836, Albert Barnes had published a commentary on Romans the year before, and even the Princeton men had some criticism. Charles Hodge was moderate in his criticism. And despite, some of this moderate criticism, the old schoolers brought charges against Barnes for a second time. So this is the 1836 trial. Let me mention some of the charges brought. And the man that brought the charges was George Junkin. He was one of the old school leaders. He's an interesting guy in his own right. But so he brings charges against Barnes. These include that Barnes held that unregenerate man can keep God's law. I don't know how accurate these are. Probably most of them wouldn't stick, but maybe some of them. That Barnes denied that God entered into a covenant with Adam, so denying the covenant of works. Denying the imputation of Adam's sin and guilt. So that gets in the fact that Barnes held what would be called immediate imputation, which was common amongst the new school. Denying substitutionary atonement. And that would be a pretty big deal if that was the case. I don't know if that's accurate. Denying the imputation of Christ's act of obedience. Because some people with justification would say Christ only forgives sin and doesn't impute his act of obedience, which is his obedience to the law. And within the Reformed tradition, there's always kind of been a strain that has denied that. Instead, teaching that, quote, justification is simply pardon. Okay, so those are the charges against Barnes in 1836. So it's interesting how this played out. Barnes had been acquitted in his trial before the Second Presbytery of Philadelphia. Remember, they split the presbyteries in Philadelphia. So it's not a surprise he's acquitted at the presbytery level, 1835. Then the synod, though, one level up, reversed the decision, and they suspended Barnes from the ministry. But so then it goes to the assembly, and then the assembly overturns his suspension in 1836. Now, Samuel Miller, if you recall, there's the three big Princeton professors at the time, Archibald Alexander, Miller, and Hodge. Miller had a resolution that the assembly judged Barnes' commentary on Romans to include, quote, opinions materially at variance with the confession of faith. So he wanted to say that it was in opposition to the confession, even though he was acquitted, and that was rejected. But just so you see the numbers, it was 109 to 122, so it's pretty close. What else did the New School do at that 1836 assembly? So they acquit Barnes. They also support the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Remember, this is the board that's outside of the church officially, and the New School tended to support these broader missions boards. So the assembly also opposed the church-established Assembly Board of Missions. So again, it's a new school victory in that regard. Okay, so 1836, obviously pivotal year, but let me back up for a moment and explain kind of the abolitionism that's going on at the assembly level. And the reason I want to do this is I think this really explains why the South gets involved. But it's also interesting to see this play out at the assembly. It's not just in the background. It really is like even at the assembly. Just to be clear, there was a reminder, there were basically three different views within the Presbyterian Church at the time regarding slavery. There's pro-slavery, there's anti-slavery, which is kind of a moderate position, and then abolitionism, which said all slavery is per se sin. It's always in and of itself wrong. And so it's the more radical view. Most old schoolers didn't hold this. Like Hodge was anti-slavery, moderate, we would say. So this is heavily tied with the New School, though not all New School men held it. So this really, abolitionism in the United States picks up in the 1830s, and so that really aligns here with the Old School, New School split, 1830s. In this case, 1835 was a big year for abolitionism at the assembly. Okay, so there were a bunch of petitions that were made against or regarding abolitionism, I should say in favor of abolitionism, from a bunch of the northern presbyteries and synods. So let me give some examples during this period. The Synod of Indiana in 1829 asked the General Assembly to take a strong action against slavery. The Synod of Illinois did the same thing in 1834. We've mentioned the Presbytery of Chillicothe, which is southern Ohio, which was a hotbed of abolitionism. 1834, that presbytery called the assembly to bar slaveholders from communion. So again, that's why it's such a big deal. They're trying to say, hey, a bunch of these guys in the South, I mean, these are ministers, elders, they're saying we should bar them from communion. So we understand the claim they're making is pretty serious, okay? So they're petitioning the assembly. Okay, now these aren't going anywhere at the time, but it's there. The Synod of Western Reserve, I think it's New York, 1835 declared slaveholding to be a sin. The Synod of Michigan in October 1835 called for slavery to cease immediately. So this is kind of common in some of these northern synods. Presbytery of Genesee, Synod of Utica, both Western New York, adopted declarations against slavery, and that's 1835. So you can see 1835 is a huge year. A lot of this stuff's around that time. 1835 as well, the Synod of Cincinnati passed resolutions denying slaveholders communion. Now they could get away with that in the North because a lot of these places there were no slaves. I mean, there's still some slavery in like New Jersey and the like, but so they could get away with it. Most of these were New School areas. The exception would be kind of southern Ohio. There were some old schoolers who were abolitionists. Okay, then the General Assembly of 1835, so still 1835, that assembly commissioned a study of slavery. So they actually said we should study the issue. Samuel Miller was the chair. But then no report was adopted. You also had a committee that was appointed to report on slavery the next year, 1836 as well. And remember, that's a New School majority. The majority in that 1836 assembly ruled that it was, quote, non-expedient to take any further order in relation to the subject. So they basically said, 1836 said, we're just not going to speak to the abolitionist issue or the slavery issue. But it's a little more complicated than that because you had abolitionist James Dickey, who was from southern Ohio. He had a minority report that called on the assembly to abolish slavery or seek to abolish slavery. So that doesn't pass, but there's a substitute motion by Reverend McElhenney of Western Virginia which stated that the Bible recognizes slavery and the assembly had no authority to exercise jurisdiction over the practice. So that's actually more the Southern view. So you got the abolitionists saying, well, let's basically adopt abolitionism. You got motions to basically adopt a pro-slavery position, or at least so that the church isn't going to interfere with it ever. But after debate, the 1836 Assembly passes James Hogue's resolution to postpone any further consideration of slavery. So it's just, well, we're just going to postpone it. Okay, we don't want to talk about it. So the problem is it's kind of burying the issue, right? It's not actually getting dealt with. In fact, that it didn't please the Southerners and it didn't please the abolitionists. So you can see so it goes nowhere. Interestingly, James Hogue, he's from Ohio. That was son of Moses Hogue. We mentioned him before, who was from Virginia and kind of found, in some sense, was the father of Union Seminary in Virginia. Okay, but this is interesting, though. Tied with this is a man named Theodore Weld. I don't know if you've heard of him before. Weld is interesting. He's an abolitionist. 1803, he died 1895. So in 1833, Weld went to Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, which was founded by the New School, and he converts them to the abolitionist cause. I mentioned this, I think, before, because Lyman Beecher was the president, and he opposes this. But a bunch of those students leave, and they go form Oberlin College, which then, that's where Finney becomes president. So you see the abolitionism's wrapped up with all this stuff. Weld became one of the first four agents to found the American Anti-Slavery Society. We've mentioned that as kind of the major abolitionist group. And then in 1836 and 7, he trained and dispatched 70 itinerant abolitionist preachers. So he's sending like the 70 out, on this mission. So what does he do? He actually goes to the 1835 Assembly, Weld does, in order to persuade Assembly members of abolitionism. So this is interesting. In one delegate from 1834, he reported that there were only two abolitionists at the 1834 Assembly. Two, right? That would be almost nothing. But by 1836, Weld claimed that 47 delegates, quote, were decidedly with us on the subject of slavery, that would have been nearly 1/4 of the Assembly. So at least from Weld's perspective, his efforts there is converting almost a quarter of the Assembly to the abolitionist position. So you can see why this becomes a big deal. One person is reported to have said that it looked, quote, as if the Presbyterian Church were becoming an abolitionist society. Right? So that's how much influence was taking place. But we should qualify that to say that most of these converts were in the North. They were in Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania. They weren't in the South. John Witherspoon, not the famous one, but this is actually his grandson, and he ministered. He was born in North Carolina, and he was ministering in South Carolina at the time. He's actually the moderator of the 1836 Assembly, John Witherspoon. He writes to Thomas Smith, another South Carolinian. He said, quote, "It is said that there are 150 abolitionists on the floor of the Assembly. I can scarcely believe this, and yet I am convinced they be very many." Okay, so he actually was worried, and that's the moderator of the 1836 Assembly. Okay, so this is becoming a big issue at the Assembly level, and just so we see how big of an issue this was, the South responds. Synod of Virginia in 1835 issued resolutions condemning abolitionism. The Synod of South Carolina and Georgia in 1836 declared that, quote, the church has no authority to legislate on this subject. Okay, so they're worried what's going on because of all of these abolitionist petitions. Even Kentucky was saying, was rejecting abolitionism. Actually, this is interesting because I think this This is prophetic in one sense. This is West Lexington, Presbyterian, Kentucky. So they issue a resolution in 1836 that slavery, though slavery was, quote, a great political and social evil, they said it was not inconsistent with the Christian profession to own slaves, and that the assembly, they said, has no right to rule on the issue. Then they say this, the Presbytery condemned, quote, abolitionist societies, or abolition societies. They were condemning them because they seek, quote, to fill the land with blood and bring on all the horrors of a servile and civil war. That's 1836, right? That's like 25 years before before the war. So people were worried, like this thing's going to blow up at some point. So that's the Southerners are condemning abolitionism, but you know what? The Northerners also had a concern, particularly the Princeton men. 1835, the Synod of Philadelphia condemned abolitionism as, quote, endangering the integrity of the American Union and the unity of the Presbyterian Church. So that's 1835. Synod, that's Synod of Philadelphia. That would be like Ashbel Green and some of those conservatives, old schoolers. But the Princeton men, right there, the peacemakers, the peacemen, they voiced concern over abolitionism. You had Hodge had a famous article in the Princeton Review in 1836 on slavery, where he basically takes this moderate position. I think I mentioned this before. But the Princeton professors were members of the Presbyterian of New Brunswick, right, New Jersey there, which later that month, this is 1836, so that right before the split the next year, 1836, the Presbyterian of New Brunswick adopts a resolution saying that slavery is, quote, a civil and not an ecclesiastical relation, and with this relation the church has no right to interfere further than to inculcate and enforce the mutual interests existing between master and slave according to the example of Christ and his apostles. So again, you see even the Princeton men are rejecting the abolitionist position. They're saying this goes way beyond the Bible, and this is wrong for the church to address it. Archibald Alexander. Now remember, Alexander's from Virginia. He's a Southerner, but he's really in this anti-slavery moderate position. He's writing in June 1836. He says, quote, the subject of slavery has been so imprudently managed that a spirit of hostility between the northern and southern states has been excited, which in my opinion will not cease until a rupture shall take place, which will mark the end of our national prosperity. So he's basically predicting civil war. But the advance of our church to a crisis has been more rapid and alarming than that of the nation. So he's also saying this is going to blow up the Presbyterian church, which in part it does. Now it's interesting, though, Alexander considered that a division into two and perhaps more sections, he says, could be a public blessing. So he actually says there could be benefit from a split. Because, he said, quote, the body at present is too large, too widely extended, and too heterogeneous to be under one ecclesiastical regimen. That's interesting to think. He says we're too diverse. Maybe we should blow this thing up. Split it into two. So I just find that interesting that Alexander said, especially the Princeton men who were trying to keep the peace. But he's writing that in June 1836, so it's getting very close to the split.
Do you want to wait on my question?
Yeah, let me just finish this section here. Then April 1837, this is right before the split happens, which is I think the next month. It's May or June. Samuel Miller is writing. This is the other Princeton guy. So you have Hodge, Alexander. Miller writes to a Virginian. He says, our abolitionist brethren, by the course which they pursue, are every day deeply wounding the cause of religion and indulging in conduct adapted to plunge both the church and state into calamities which they can never repair. I cling to the hope that a large majority of our church will frown on the conduct of those brethren and refuse to take another step of concurrence with a course so demented and destructive. So basically, all three of the major Princeton professors are saying this abolitionism stuff is getting out of control. They're very concerned, even though none of them would qualify as pro-slavery of those three. So I think we can say this. So the discussion of slavery at the 1836 assembly, it was indefinitely postponed. Okay. However, all of these New School protests, mostly New School protests, strengthen the association of abolitionism with the New School. So the Old School is tying abolitionism with the New School, which is I think for the most part correct. It doesn't align perfectly. So this is one, Ernest Trice Thompson, he was a historian. He said that many Southerners came to view abolitionism as, quote, a natural child of New School heresy. So that's the case. They're just tying the two together, and I think for good reason. And so this leads the South, including really their leader, George Baxter, who we've talked about, president of Union Seminary. It leads them all to side with or for the most part, leads the South to side with the old school. And end that, remember I mentioned before there was Southern neutrality. Well, that's gone at this point. Abolitionism ensured that that's gone, and that the South's with the old school. The only thing is some of like the guys like Baxter had some concerns of antinomian tenets, they said, of the old school. But other than that, they're like, yeah, we're done. So I want to explain kind of how this plays out, the split. But go ahead, Chris. We'll take a break there for questions.
I'm just interested in the rightness and wrongness of this kicking the can down the road decision.
Yeah. Well, this isn't the end of it.
Over and over again, it never works out well in the end, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, though, because you get to 1845, which is still, before the Civil War, and the old school rules in 1845 is kind of a famous position. They do take that position that slavery is a civil institution and the church has no right to rule on it either way. So that they actually take that.
But I'm thinking of all the things that people claim now, even in the current day. That the church has nothing to say about abortion. That's a civil thing. That the church has nothing to say about, I realize the church is not the government. There are different spheres but is the church to just be silent about civil things? That just seems like a
now you're getting into a controversial issue, basically the spirituality of the church, and I was even writing something that I finished up yesterday, actually, on this. The PCA had this petition in 2023, so last year's assembly, against it was an overture, and the assembly voted for the moderator appointed committee so that they send a letter to the federal government against transgender surgeries. It's broader than that, but it's the main thing. Transgender surgeries, especially on minors. And then there was a significant part of the assembly that voted against this, and their whole thing is, well, we agree with you on the issue, but we don't think the church should speak to the state here. Okay, so this is somewhat complicated, but there's even an article earlier in April by a man named T. David Gordon, and because he issued a protest in his presbytery. Because his presbytery sent up the letter to the local, state legislature and whatnot, and he protested it, and he gives his reason as why he thinks it violates the spirituality of the church, and especially Westminster Confession 31.4, which says that it basically says the church, the synods and councils should only speak to that which is ecclesiastical, but it gives some exceptions. One is if the state asks the church for advice. The other one is if the church can make humble petition in cases extraordinary. So there's debate over what's an extraordinary case. Now, I think what the PCA did is fine per the confession, 31.4. I also think it's consistent with what the American church has done over the years. We mentioned before there was an 1818 petition, or it wasn't petition, but statement on slavery. It's kind of in the background of all of this, which was somewhat of a complicated statement because it condemned slavery as a system, but also condemned abolitionism, and then basically laid out some duties between masters and slaves, and how the churches should handle things. So it's somewhat complicated, but they did wade into this. But the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in the early 1800s, 1812, and some other years, they also They did specifically make petitions to the government on Sabbath mail, Sunday mail, and they didn't do it just on the basis of it affecting the church. They said it also is just bad for society. So that's where I think T. David Gordon is wrong. At least his take is not consistent with what the American church has practiced. So all of that to say is, look, not everything should be handled at the assembly level. The problem is I mean, the abolitionists were trying to, in one sense, think what they're trying to do. They're trying to kick out the slaveholders out of the church. So obviously that's like a pretty, like if they weren't seeking to do that, then nobody else would care, and they could just say, well, we don't need to address this at the assembly level. So in one sense, you could say the abolitionists were at fault for all of this. They're trying to excommunicate some of their fellow ministers. But obviously they felt so strongly that was their view, is they thought it violated Scripture. Now, I think that's wrong, but go ahead.
Just an interesting thing to think about. So Andrew Jackson was president from 29 to 37, and I tend to think that might have had a little something to do with it too. Just his kind of bombasticness maybe stirred up.
Yeah, I don't know how much that related. You do have the whole nullification crisis. I forgot what year that was. It was 1830 something. Where he threatened to go into South Carolina and hang John C. Calhoun. So,
he had been a big states' rights person, then he's president.
Yeah, well, and Jackson was a Presbyterian, by the way, which is funny. And Calhoun was a Unitarian essentially, but he was a descendant of it's like his grandfather or somebody was a Presbyterian elder. So anyway, yeah, I mean South Carolina, so you can have some Presbyterians in there. So yeah, interesting times. 1830s are a fascinating period. So go ahead, Charlie.
The abolitionists, did they have any heart for the welfare of the slaves at all?
I think some of them probably did, but I mean, it's hard for me. Like I read this, it just seems like such like a political thing. That I mean, look, nobody is saying this, or at least not the vast majority. Nobody's saying, "Hey, free your slaves and let them move up in my town, and we'll take care of them." No, nobody speaks this way.
No.
It's always just, you guys are evil because you have slaves. Nobody wants to actually aid, the South. I mean, the anti-slavery moderates basically, they promoted colonization. So they said, well, we should free the slaves, but what should we do with them? Well, let's send them back to Africa. All right? So that was their position. So anyway, yeah. I mean, I don't read the abolitionists as pure-hearted guys. So. Okay, anything else there before we move on? So lots of interesting topics. Well, hopefully, Chris, I addressed your question somewhat. Is that some of this is complicated, and I mean, the assembly didn't want to deal with it because they knew it would probably blow up the church. Is the problem is if we take a ruling either way, it's going to really cause a problem. Which I guess just shows like how divided things were. But were they going to split along abolitionist lines? Well, probably not. It made more sense to split because you already had, the abolitionism is coming in on top of the old school, new school divide, right? So it's like you got two things going on. And George Baxter basically makes the decision. He says, well, if we kick out the new school and we split with them, that'll mostly solve the abolitionist problem. And he was right. And it did. Because the old school was non-abolitionist. I mean, they had some, but they were such a small minority, they had no power.
Just following on Chris's thing, there's two different ways that the assembly can act. One is to promote something in the Senate that the government does what we try to do. The other is this is recommendation of what we want to do.
Right.
Okay, that isn't binding, but it tells you, that's what we did in the 487 with the nuclear weapons thing.
Yes, and we have these position papers that are, yeah.
Say, this is what we think is the right thing to do, but we're not telling everybody that's what you got to do.
Right, so like the PCA, they'll have position papers, they're non-binding. I disagree with some of the things that have been written in them. That's fine, that's my prerogative. Because they don't bind us, they're not constitutional. We can make petitions to the government, but we can also just have like these general statements like they did. But go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I I guess I'm seeing there's a bit of a difference here between what should be preached from our pulpits
Yes.
and what should be enacted in our General Assembly. And
Yeah,
I hadn't maybe
yeah.
thought of it in that way
Right.
before, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right, but part of the problem is this stuff was getting preached in some pulpits, but it obviously was inconsistent. And there's a lot of disagreement. I would say for the most part, I mean, as far as the spirituality of the church goes, the Southern position essentially was we shouldn't speak to civil affairs regarding slavery or colonization and the like, but the pulpits, we should speak to masters and slaves and their duties, because that's what the Bible says. So you're obviously going to come to those passages, you have to preach them. But yeah, I mean, the abolitionist position, the problem is they think the Bible condemns slavery per se, and therefore they think that the Bible requires that the church condemn slavery and excommunicate the slaveholder. So obviously, like, part of the problem is they're interpreting the Bible differently here and applying it differently. So but you're right. There's both assembly, which would be like joint. You could call that like joint assembly actions, and then there's individual pulpits. And just because you can or should preach something from the pulpit doesn't necessarily mean that the assembly should make a statement. So yeah, again, this stuff does get complicated, and there's a lot of disagreement on this.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Chris's example of abortion was interesting because, so I feel like, with slavery, the Bible is nuanced for sure. With something like abortion, I feel like the Bible is just simply, you don't take innocent life. And so it's interesting. I mean, they're parallel in some ways and maybe in some ways not.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think some people try to draw too strong of parallels between them today. I do think abortion, and hopefully even maybe as we've seen the Princeton men speaking on this issue, abortion's a more simple situation or issue. And so like the PCA, actually I think it was last year, 2022, there was a statement was adopted with a petition to the government. And I think that, most people would agree with that. I mean, I hope there's no one in the PCA that's like ministers or whatnot that's okay with abortion. So obviously it's taking an innocent life. So okay. So we mentioned George Baxter. I'm going to mention him, or just write his name up here, because he's a big deal. He gets neglected a lot, but he's a big deal, especially at the 1837 Assembly. So what's interesting, though, is at the time, the Synod of Virginia, which he was a part of, and actually had partial control over the Union Theological Seminary, the Synod had not supported the Acton Testimony. It had not sent delegates to the 1835 Pre-Assembly Old School Convention, and its delegates had not voted, or had even voted with the New School on issues at the 1835 Assembly. So that just shows the South was not entirely, especially in Virginia, they were not entirely with the Old School, but Baxter helped lead them in that direction. Now, there were some differences, though. In 1836, the Synod of Virginia unanimously adopted a paper regarding some of the concerns of the church, and they at this point do affirm the Old School position. One of the interesting things is this had Baxter, it had William Swan Plumer, we talked about him. It also had a man named William Hill. I won't say too much on him, but Hill is interesting because he actually goes with the New School. He doesn't like how Baxter and the Old School basically kick out a few of these New School synods. They think it's unconstitutional, and so he goes with the New School. And actually, that's a big reason you have New School churches in the South in the first place. Is for the most part, they're not New School in theology. They just oppose how the split goes down. They think it's unconstitutional, and so you have it's like 10% or something of the Southern churches go with the New School and not the Old School. Ironically, they're going to end up splitting themselves from the New School in 1857 over the slavery issue. So it still blows up the New School, or at least like they're a minority there, but still, the slavery issue is never gone, or abolitionism. So this 1836 Synod of Virginia, and again, William Hill votes with them on this. It's interesting what they state because they condemn abolitionism. And one of the arguments they make against abolitionism, I won't get into all of this, but one thing they say is that the abolitionists, quote, attempt to make slaveholding a bar to communion or to fair ministerial standing now is changing the constitution of our church and the original terms of communion. This we cannot permit. So one of the arguments against abolitionism, and I think this is a pretty good one, is, hey guys, we formed this church when a bunch of us had slaves already, and you're now trying to say that is means for excommunicating someone. You're changing the constitution of the church. You can't do that. They even had the 1818 statement. So I think that's correct. Abolitionism is trying to change the constitution of the church. But it's interesting because this synod, 1836, they not only condemn abolitionism, but they also condemn New School errors. Let me mention some of these because this is interesting. They said that these errors, they thought, furnished just ground of alarm to the church, and they said they related to original sin, regeneration, justification by the righteousness of Christ, and the ability of the creature. So I guess I won't mention all of this, but they do for original sin. they affirmed that Adam's guilt was imputed to his posterity, but they regretted some of these phrases that were being thrown around. So that they're critical of these. They still give some examples. First would be original sin is no sin, but a mere tendency to sin, which in itself is not sinful. So I guess that was something that was being thrown around. At least this is what they're claiming. Second, the posterity of Adam are in no sense guilty of or liable for his first sin. So that would just be a denial of Adam's guilt, or guilt for Adam's sin. Third, that men are born innocent and without moral character. So some of this is just straight up denial of original sin. Wherever they didn't say who was saying what. They have concerns about other things, justification, moral agency. So there's a variety of things they're concerned about. And yet, I mentioned that antinomian issue. So they were concerned, the Synod of Virginia is concerned not only from the New School errors, but also antinomianism. And basically that there was a form of fatalism that was being promoted. So again, it'd be interesting. They don't usually give names in these kind of things, but they're just saying here's our concern of the errors. Okay, so that's the Synod of Virginia. So that's 1836, which leads into the actual split, 1837 at the assembly level. So as I mentioned, you have the old school gains a majority now at the 1837 assembly. Remember, they lost the year before. Albert Barnes was acquitted. So they're like, enough is enough. We're going to split the church. I mean, basically, that's what the old school decided. We're going to go through with this. They had, again, a pre-assembly meeting, right? A convention, 1837. Baxter was the moderator of this meeting. So Baxter's a big deal. He's listed as president, and then R.J. Breckinridge was the primary author, and they write this thing called the Testimony and Memorial. And it's similar to the prior things, the Act and Testimony. I realize they have a lot of similar names. So this Testimony Memorial calls for the abrogation of the 1801 Plan of Union. If you remember that, the Presbyterians made with the Congregationalists. So they're going to abrogate that. They call for breaking off ties with the American Home Missionary Society and the American Education Society. So they're going to break off with these cooperative groups, missions groups. And they call for the dissolution of every church, Presbyterian synod that were not organized on Presbyterian principles. That's where the Princeton men did not want to do this, but this is where the old school is going to go. So they've got their Testimony Memorial condemns 16 doctrinal errors. just so you know the subjects, I won't list everything. There's original sin, imputation of Adam's guilt, and Christ's righteousness, substitutionary atonement. They're saying they reject these things, the new school. Irresistible grace. They're even asserting that there's like Arminianism within the new school, that they're saying that election is founded on foreseen faith. So I don't know how prominent this was, but there's other errors they list. They're basically saying discipline is not being carried out. The church is a mess. It's kind of my summary. So then they present this testimony memorial to the 1837 assembly. It's given to a committee, special committee, consisted mostly of Southerners. This is interesting. This committee this is the assembly level, 1837. The committee has Baxter, Archibald Alexander, right, one of the Princeton moderates, William Swan Plumer, who's an old school man, A.W. Leland, he's a professor at Columbia Seminary, where Thornwell later teaches, and Ashbel Green, he's northern Philadelphia guy, but he's an old school leader. And then a couple ruling elders. So the assembly then passes the resolution 143 to 110 that abrogates the plan of union. So that the Princeton men wanted that, but again, they go further, and Plumer, being the old schooler that he was, brings a motion, and then the assembly passes it 135 to 105, and they dissolve the Synod of Western Reserve because it was created by the plan of union, and then they proceed to dissolve three other synods in Western New York, Utica, Geneva, and Genesee. So, so they dissolve four synods. So that's a big deal. I mean, can you imagine? These aren't presbyteries. These are synods. These are like made up of presbyteries. So I don't remember the number, but it's a ton of presbyteries and churches under this, and they're saying you guys aren't part of our church anymore because you're related to the plan. You're created out of the plan of union. So again, there was opposition to that. And so some people joined with the new school because of such opposition. Now, this is interesting how this plays out. Eventually, Union Theological Seminary, where Baxter is president, they eventually approve a resolutions done by the Synod of North Carolina, because actually Union Seminary, part of the reason it's called Union, is you had the Synod of Virginia and the Synod of North Carolina that they were united in running the seminary. So they approve these resolutions to side with the old school. So Union is going to be an old school seminary. There were a couple of faculty members that were Northerners who were critical of Baxter and the 1837 assembly. They resigned from Union Seminary. And basically from this point on, Union is going to be it's going to be old school, and it's going to be mostly Southern. They're professors, so that really changes kind of the dynamics of things. Just to come back, so that's 1837. The next year, 1838, is kind of wild because you had all these new school synods that were kicked out, right? But what's going to happen? Well, the new school's commissioners, they still come to the meeting, 1837 assembly, and they're trying to be a part of it. And what ends up happening is so both groups had their prior meetings prior to the assembly in Philadelphia, 1838. On the first day of the assembly, new schooler William Hill, right, he's from Virginia, he presents resolutions to reinstate the four dissolved synods, but then an old school committee of three, which included Baxter and then a man named William Maxwell, he's also from Virginia, they reject the resolution. So these are fellow Virginian, Synod of Virginia guys who are fighting over this stuff, which is funny. The four dissolved synods were refused enrollment at the assembly. They're like, we don't know you guys. You're not allowed to be here. Then basically what ends up happening is you have two assemblies of similar sizes. The new school commissioners, they go form their own assembly. They elect a moderator and clerks. They adjourn to the assembly to the First Presbyterian Church, and then you have the remaining old schoolers. They organize their own assembly, and they elect William Swan Plumer as moderator. So they just they have two assemblies going on at the same time in the same city. To make it even more complicated, the new school calls itself the Constitutional Assembly, right? Because they didn't violate the Constitution like the old schoolers. And the old schoolers call their church the Reforming Assembly. So that's the official names of those churches, is the Constitutional Assembly and the Reforming Assembly. This actually goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. So it goes through the civil courts, which ends up affirming the old school's position. They said they rule it's constitutional, and that's important, I guess, just for name and everything related to the church. But you end up with two separate churches, old school, new school. One more thing I'll say here before we take questions is most of the southern churches, as I said, went with the new school, but you did have some that went with, there's some that remained independent, which is odd. Charleston, Union, Presbyterian remained independent. What's crazy is just the way this plays out, you have a lot of splits even amongst churches. So some pastors and elders left the Presbytery of East Hanover, which is Virginia, and in the Presbytery of West Hanover to form the Presbytery of Hanover under the New School Constitutional Assembly. So some Virginians leave and go New School. You also had congregations divide. Some go New School. The New School Synod of Virginia consisted of 3 presbyteries. And in 1840, just to give the numbers here, so in 1840, the New School had about 28 pastors, 47 churches, 2,000 members, and the Old School Synod of Virginia had 90 pastors, 131 churches, 9,350 members. So, over 4 times the size of the New School. So this is in Virginia, you still had a substantial New School. And then when you get in the border states, it's even crazier. I'm not going to get into all of that right now. The Synod of Tennessee actually votes, they condemn the actions of the Old School Assembly, and they're the only synod in the South with a New School majority. So most of the synods were Old School majorities, but then sometimes you had churches and presbyteries break off. So the Synod of West Tennessee was divided, so they end up splitting. So here's the numbers. Here's the numbers at the end of the day, because you got Old School, New School. This is overall. This is from 1840, so this is a couple years after. Just gives us an idea. The Reforming Assembly says Old School, they have about 126,000 communicants. Okay, so we're rounding. And the New School has 102,000. So you can see these are similar sized bodies. They're not. This is why things were going back and forth. And actually, Old School has 1,600 pastors, and the New School has 1,200. Okay, so in a sense, almost split in half. Now, what's going to be interesting is there's going to be some reorganization, because this is 1837-8. As I mentioned, the Southern New School will split in 1857. They're actually going to join the Southern Church in 1864. And then you'll have the New School, which will join with the Northern Church, because the Old School is going to split in 1861 because of the Civil War. So you're going to get realignment, and I'll explain this more in detail another day, but you're going to get realignment where you have a Northern and a Southern Church, because they realign. So you have another couple splits and then realignments. But this is huge, because this never is really fixed. This Old School, New School split, or at least it gets reorganized into North-South, which is wild. But okay, any questions there before we close?
It just seems like thematically, whether it's the slavery issue or it's free will, the New School is trying to, they make the mold and they try to pour
One of the things that's, I think, noticeable about the New School is they do tend to get wrapped up in like social movements. So that is noticeable. And actually, there's debate, some sense debate over, the Northern Church actually ends up going liberal before the Southern Church. They start to have some liberalism in like the late 1800s, where the Southern Church doesn't really start to have that until like the 1930s. Now, some of that is maybe just due to lesser influence of German higher criticism and the like in the seminaries. But I tend to think that the New School, particularly the Northern New School, was not only more latitudinarian, is that the right term, for broader in their subscription practice, which is a problem, but they also are just wrapped up in fundamentalism and abolitionism and even like teetotalism and some of these things, and they bring that into the Northern Church. And so when the Northern Old School unites with them. And so that's my take as I think why actually the Northern Church goes liberal, is I do think the New School is a problem. So, but it's not always, everybody wants to, or not everybody, a lot of guys want to point to the subscriptional laxity. I actually think it's more so, that's part of it, but more so it's just their obsession with social movements. They almost have like a fundamentalist bent in some ways, though people also tie them with liberalism. The New School is goofy. Go ahead.
So, trying to normalize these numbers a little bit. The population of the U.S. in the 1840s was about 17 million. So, I mean, so that's like 1/20th almost of the U.S. today. So,
Yeah.
So these, you look at these numbers, well, 100,000, who cares? But it's a bigger number at the time.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, proportionally, the Presbyterians were a much larger proportion of the population back then. Because even here, if you're at 230,000 of, you said 17 million? Yeah, so 230,000 of 17 million. I mean, today the PCA is like 380,000, but of 350 million. I mean, so we really haven't, I mean, I know there's some other denominations. Even if we were to say there's, 500,000 confessional Reformed Presbyterian people, even if we said there's 1 million, that's a drop in the bucket when you're talking about 350 million people, okay? So, yeah, and by the way, this is the Presbyterians. The Methodists are at like 1 million at the time. Like they're a huge chunk. And then what ends up happening though is the Catholics come in and they start moving in, and the Catholics quickly become the largest denomination in the United States. And I mean like that, which is a problem, right? You had what was a 98% Protestant country, and it then becomes predominantly Catholic within a short time, which is why there's all the nativism and opposition to Catholic immigration. But that's a whole other issue I'm just bringing up. Okay, well, let's stop there. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for all of this history of the old school, new school split. Lord, help us to learn from these things. Help us to take interest in them, but also to apply them to today and to know your word and theology better and have better church practice. So bless us now as we prepare for worship. We ask this in the name of your Son. Amen.